The South Carolina night wasn't just dark, it was a physical weight, a velvet shroud soaked in the salt and rot of the low-country marshes. In the cramped quarters of the Sterling plantation, the air moved like warm molasses, thick with the unsaid prayers of those huddled in the shadows. Zora sat on the edge of her straw-stuffed pallet, her body perfectly still, though her mind was a whirlwind of frantic calculations. She was 24 years old, a woman whose worth was measured in the Sterling ledgers as precisely $500, a figure that ignored the fire in her spirit and focused solely on the strength in her back and the supposed fertility of her womb. Her hands, rough from years of pulling indigo and cotton, were clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned a ghostly white. Across the room, the moonlight bled through the cracks in the cypress walls, illuminating a single knot in the wood that Zora stared at until it seemed to pulse like a dying heart. She wasn't looking at the wood. She was staring into the abyss of a future that had been stolen from her before she was even born. The scars on her shoulders, a jagged cartography of past insubordinations, throbbed in the oppressive heat, a constant reminder that in this world her humanity was an inconvenience to be beaten out of her. To the owners of this land, she was merely a tool, a piece of living property whose only purpose was to generate wealth she would never see. The announcement of her fate had come 2 days prior, delivered by Mace Crowley, the overseer whose presence always carried the sharp, acidic tang of cheap tobacco and unearned malice. He had stood at the edge of the fields, his whip coiled like a sleeping viper at his hip, and told Zora she had been sold to a sugar planter from the deep reaches of Louisiana. It wasn't presented as a choice, it was a transaction finalized over a glass of expensive bourbon in the big house. To men like Archibald Sterling, Zora was not a woman with dreams or a lineage. She was prime stock, a commodity to be liquidated when the debts mounted or the whim took them. The trader was due in 72 hours. In 3 days, Zora would be chained to a coffle, a brutal line of human beings bound by iron, and marched hundreds of miles away from the only slivers of peace she had ever known. The thought of the cane fields, those green graveyards where the sun was a hammer and the work never ended, sent a cold shiver through her despite the sweltering night. But it wasn't just the fear of the lash or the grueling labor that threatened to break her. It was the thought of Kaelen. In the eyes of the law, their bond was non-existent, but in the reality of their hearts, he was her anchor in a storm that had lasted for centuries. Kaelen was a man of iron and silence, a wheelwright whose hands could mend the most broken wagons and whose eyes held a depth of love that the plantation's cruelty could never quite extinguish. They were married in the only way the law allowed, a quiet promise made under the sprawling canopy of a live oak, with the Spanish moss hanging like grey lace around them and the stars as their only witnesses. To the ledger keepers, Kaelen was a valuable asset, too skilled to be sold off lightly. This was the ultimate psychological torture of their situation. His value meant he would stay, and her value meant she would be taken. Their life together, built in the stolen hours between sunset and dawn, was to be dismantled as casually as a child crushing an anthill. If you're finding yourself drawn into Zora's journey of resilience, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support ensures that these narratives of untold courage continue to reach the world. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from. For Zora, the time for mourning had passed. The time for the impossible had begun. She knew that the mathematics of the plantation demanded her submission, but she was beginning to realize that she no longer cared for the plantation's arithmetic. The quarters were silent now, save for the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the exhausted souls around her. Zora stood up, her movements fluid and ghost-like, a skill honed by years of trying to remain invisible to the predatory eyes of the patrollers. She stepped out into the night, the grass cool against her bare feet, and made her way toward the forge where the scent of charcoal and burnt metal still lingered. Kaelen was there, waiting in the shadows of the doorway. They didn't need words. The air between them was charged with the electricity of a shared, desperate resolve. "They come on the 3rd day," she whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the night. Kaelen reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that defied the harshness of their lives. "Then we don't wait for the sun to rise on that day," he replied, his voice a low rumble of defiance. "We run, Zora. North. We follow the tracks the elders whispered about. Running was a gamble with death. It meant being hunted by men like Harlan Vance, a man who treated catching runaways like a blood sport, and whose hounds were bred to recognize the specific scent of terrified, fleeing human beings. The geography of their escape was a terrifying map of hostile territory. They would have to navigate the labyrinthine marshes of the Lowcountry, avoiding the main roads and the watchful eyes of the local slave patrols, groups of white men empowered by law to stop and search any person of color at any time. Every white face would be a potential captor, every lantern light in the distance a mortal threat. They would have to rely on the drinking gourd, the North Star, and the whispered legends of the Underground Railroad, a hidden network of brave souls willing to risk the gallows to help others reach the promised land of freedom. As they stood together in the darkness, the big house loomed on the hill, its white columns like the ribs of a leviathan that had swallowed their lives whole. Beyond the fields lay the black water swamps, a place of snakes, silt, and secrets. To most, the swamp was a nightmare of treacherous terrain, but to Zora and Kaelen, it was the only path to a dream. They would leave the next night, under the cover of a new moon, stepping away from the certainty of bondage and into the perilous, beautiful unknown of a chosen fate. The preparation for their flight was a delicate dance of secrecy. Zora had spent the day working in the big house, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality while her ears were tuned to every conversation. She had managed to secure a small bundle of supplies, salt pork, dried corn, and a heavy iron knife she had spirited away from the kitchen. She also carried a small leather pouch given to her by an elder named Miriam, filled with a mixture of pungent herbs and pepper. "To throw off the noses of the dogs," Miriam had whispered, her eyes full of a sorrowful wisdom. This was the informational side of survival, knowing that the system was backed by biology as much as by law. The hounds were the primary weapon of the hunters, capable of tracking a scent for miles through even the most difficult terrain. As the sun began to set on their final day of captivity, the atmosphere on the plantation shifted. There was a tension in the air, a sense of an ending. Zora and Kaelen met one last time behind the smokehouse, the shadows lengthening around them like bars. They were no longer just a wheelwright and a field hand. They were fugitives in waiting, two people who had decided that the risk of a violent death was preferable to the certainty of a soul-crushing life. The transition from property to fugitive happened in the silent space between two heartbeats. As the final lantern in the big house flickered out, Zora and Kaelen stepped into the obsidian embrace of the woods, the familiar outlines of the plantation dissolving into the fog behind them. Every snap of a dry twig sounded like a pistol shot in the heavy silence. Every rustle of the wind through the pines felt like a reaching hand. They moved with a desperate rhythmic grace, their bodies low to the ground, navigating by the ancestral memory of the land rather than by sight. This was the first test of their resolve, the psychological hurdle of crossing the physical boundary of the Sterling estate. To cross that fence line was to shed the safety of the known, however brutal it was, and enter a realm where the law of the land was replaced by the law of the hunt. Zora could feel the weight of the kitchen knife against her thigh, a cold piece of iron that was now more than a tool. It was a symbol of her reclaimed agency. They reached the edge of the Blackwater swamp, a sprawling labyrinth of cypress knees and tannin-stained pools that stood as the first major barrier between them and the distant promise of the north. The water was waist-deep in places, a dark mirror reflecting nothing but the void above, and as they stepped in, the chill of the marsh seeped into their bones, a stark contrast to the humid air that still clung to their skin. The Lowcountry swamp was a cathedral of rot and resilience, a place where the geography itself seemed to conspire against the uninitiated. Huge cypress trees rose like the columns of a sunken temple, draped in Spanish moss that swayed like the tattered banners of a forgotten army. For Zora and Kaelen, the swamp was a tactical choice, a gamble that the treacherous mud and unpredictable currents would discourage immediate pursuit. Bloodhounds were legendary for their tracking abilities, but water was the great equalizer, fracturing scent trails and turning a linear chase into a frustrated search. However, the cost of this tactical advantage was a physical toll that began to mount almost immediately. Their muscles burned from the effort of pulling their feet from the suction of the mud, and the constant vigilance required to avoid cottonmouth snakes and hidden gators drained their mental reserves. Every splash was a potential alarm, every shadow a lurking patroller. Informational accounts from this era often highlight that for freedom seekers, the environment was as much an adversary as the men hunting them. The swamp was indifferent to their plight, a prehistoric wilderness that demanded total focus just to survive the next 10 paces. Yet, as they pushed deeper into the mire, Zora felt a strange, flickering spark of dignity. For the first time in her 24 years, she wasn't moving because a whip commanded it. She was moving because her soul demanded it. The silence of the marsh was shattered by a sound that made the blood in Zora's veins turn to ice, the distant, haunting bay of a hound. It wasn't the casual bark of a farm dog, it was the rhythmic, high-pitched ringing that indicated a pack had found a scent they weren't supposed to know yet. The realization hit Zora like a physical blow. Someone had talked, or perhaps the overseer, Mace Crowley, had performed a midnight check. The mathematics of their escape had just shifted from a head start to a desperate scramble. Behind them, flickering orange glows began to dance through the trees, torches. Harlan Vance was already in the field. Vance was a man who saw the world through the lens of a ledger and a leash. He was a specialist in the recovery of lost assets, and his reputation for efficiency was matched only by his penchant for creative cruelty. He didn't just want to catch them, he wanted to break them in a way that would serve as a gruesome tableau for anyone else considering the same path. If you are captivated by the sheer will it takes to face such overwhelming odds, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Your engagement helps us keep these stories of historical grit and human spirit alive. Tell me in the comments, what do you think is the most powerful weapon a person can have in a situation like this? They found a hollow beneath a massive fallen cedar, its roots tangled like the bleached ribs of a shipwreck. They pressed themselves into the muck, the smell of damp earth and decay filling their lungs as the torches drew closer. Through the gaps in the roots, Zora could see the silhouettes of 5 men on horseback, their rifles glinting in the firelight. Harlan Vance sat atop a powerful bay, his face a mask of cold professional focus. The men with him were poor whites, men who owned no land or people themselves, but who guarded the institution of slavery with a religious fervor because it was the only thing that kept them from the bottom of the social hierarchy. "The water's high," Vance growled, his voice carrying clearly across the stagnant pool. "They're heading for the deep marsh, thinking the mud will save them. But a man in a hurry leaves a wake. Even in this soup, we circle to the north ridge and wait for the sun. There's only one way out of this swamp that doesn't lead to a grave, and I'll be sitting on it by dawn." The casual way he spoke of their lives, as if they were merely problems in a geometry of capture, fueled a cold, sharp rage in Zora's chest. She realized then that this wasn't just about distance. It was a war of wills between those who believed in their right to own and those who knew their right to be. The patrol moved on, the orange glow of their torches slowly fading into a dim amber before vanishing entirely. But Zora and Kaelen remained motionless for nearly an hour, their bodies shivering in the pre-dawn chill. The psychological pressure of the hunt was a unique form of torment. It forced the fugitive to exist in a state of hyper-awareness where every sense was dialed to a painful intensity. When they finally emerged from the roots, their clothes were heavy with silt and their skin was mapped with 100 small scratches from the marsh grass. "We can't go to the north ridge," Kaelen whispered, his voice raspy but steady. "Vance knows the paths. We have to go deeper, where even the horses can't follow." This was the choosing that the elders often spoke of, the moment where you decided exactly how much you were willing to pay for a chance at a breath that belonged only to you. To go deeper into the swamp meant risking the bottomless mud and the rising tide, but staying near the edges was a guaranteed appointment with the lash. They turned away from the ridge and pushed toward the heart of the Lowcountry, toward the places where the sun barely touched the water, and the only law was the ancient, indifferent silence of the deep woods. By the time the first grey light of morning began to filter through the canopy, they were miles from the plantation, yet they felt no closer to safety. The swamp had become a blur of exhaustion. Zora's feet were numb, and the small bag of corn Miriam had given her felt like a weight of lead. They found a small hummock of dry land, barely larger than a dining table, protected by a dense screen of palmetto fronds. Here they collapsed, not out of a sense of security, but because their bodies simply refused to carry them another step. Kaelen pulled Zora close, his warmth the only thing tethering her to the world as the reality of their situation began to settle in. They were two people against an empire, two hearts against a system built on iron and bone. But as Zora closed her eyes, she didn't see the chains or the torches. She saw the drinking gourd still burning in her mind's eye, a celestial beacon that promised that while the path was narrow and the gate was straight, the direction was true. They would rest for an hour, and then they would become the shadows the hunters couldn't catch, moving with the quiet, relentless purpose of water seeking the sea. The second day of their flight brought a new kind of terror, the terror of visibility. As they emerged from the protective rot of the swamp, the landscape shifted into a patchwork of sprawling indigo farms and small, dusty homesteads. In the swamp, the enemy was the earth itself. Here, the enemy was every eye that turned their way. They moved through the high grass of the fallow fields, their bodies bent low, hearts drumming against their ribs like trapped birds. The sun was a relentless judge, stripping away the anonymity of the night and exposing their tattered clothes and mud-caked skin to a world that saw them as walking currency. They found shelter in a dilapidated tobacco barn, its slats groaning in the wind, and huddled in the loft. It was here that Kaelen found a discarded, rain-smudged newspaper. On the third page, a headline leapt out like a physical strike. Reward, $2,500 for the recapture of the death couple. The text below described them as armed and desperate, claiming they had nearly killed a patroller during their escape. It was a fabrication designed to justify a dead or alive mandate. This was the psychological warfare of the bounty system. By labeling them as killers, the law effectively placed them outside the realm of human mercy, turning every citizen into a state-sanctioned executioner. The staggering sum of $2,500 was enough to tempt even the most pious neighbor to look for blood in the shadows. The weight of that bounty sat in the air between them, more suffocating than the heat of the loft. At that price, they were no longer just people. They were a fortune on two legs, and the arithmetic of betrayal became a constant threat. "They're making us into monsters," Kaelen whispered, his thumb tracing the jagged scar on his forearm where the forge had bit him years ago. Zora looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering light through the barn walls. "They have to," she replied, "because if they admitted we were just a man and a woman wanting to be free, the whole world they built would start to look like the crime it is." If this exploration of the psychological and historical depth of the struggle for freedom is providing value to you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us elevate these narratives of courage. Share your thoughts in the comments. Why do you think the system worked so hard to demonize those who simply wanted to leave? For Zora and Kaelen, the realization was clear. The further they traveled, the more valuable their capture became. They weren't just fleeing a plantation anymore. They were fleeing a myth that had been constructed around them to ensure they never reached the north alive. They waited for the sun to dip below the horizon, the hours passing with agonizing slowness until the shadows grew long enough to act as their armor once again. They reached the outskirts of a small Quaker settlement just as the moon rose, a pale silver sliver in the sky. Following a set of cryptic directions whispered by an elder weeks ago, they approached a modest stone farmhouse with a single candle burning in a second-floor window, the signal of a station on the hidden road. The door was opened by the widow Holloway, a woman whose face was a map of stern discipline and quiet kindness. She didn't ask for their names or their histories. She simply looked at their exhausted forms and stepped aside. "Friend, thou art in need of rest," she said, her voice a soothing balm after the days of whispered terror. She led them to a kitchen that smelled of yeast and dried herbs, where she fed them thick bread and salt pork. But the safety was a fragile glass. "Harlan Vance and his men were here this afternoon," she told them, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "They searched the barn and the outbuildings. They are convinced you are headed for the river, and they have doubled the watches at every crossing. My house is watched, but they do not expect me to hide you where you are going." She moved a heavy, hand-woven rug in the corner of the room, revealing a narrow trapdoor flush with the floorboards. The space beneath the floor was a cold, damp void, barely large enough for two people to lie side by side. Descending into it felt like entering a grave, a sensory deprivation chamber where the only sounds were the scurrying of mice and the thumping of the widow's footsteps above. "Stay silent," she warned as she lowered the door. "If the patrol returns, do not even breathe." The darkness was absolute, a heavy velvet that pressed against Zora's eyes. Beside her, she could feel Kaelen's heat, his steady breath, the only thing keeping the panic at bay. This was the reality of the Underground Railroad, not a literal train, but a series of holes, attics, and false walls where the price of freedom was a temporary burial. After what felt like hours, the silence was shattered by a heavy pounding at the front door. "Open in the name of the law!" a voice boomed, the unmistakable, gravelly roar of Mace Crowley. Zora's hand found Kaelen's, her fingers digging into his palm. Above them, they heard the front door creak open and the aggressive thud of boots on the floorboards. The searchers were inside. "We know they're in this area, widow," Crowley shouted, his voice vibrating through the floorboards just inches from Zora's ear. "A boy saw two shadows heading toward this ridge. If you're harboring them, your faith won't save you from the gallows." The widow Halloway's voice remained unnervingly calm. "Thou art welcome to search, Mace Crowley, but thou wilt find nothing but the dust of an old woman's house. I have told thee before, I do not keep property that does not belong to me." The sound of chairs being overturned and cupboards being flung open echoed through the house. One of the patrollers walked directly over the trapdoor, the wood groaning under his weight. Zora squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the man above could hear it through the timber. The scent of Crowley's cheap whiskey and stale sweat seemed to seep through the cracks, a sensory ghost of the plantation they had left behind. For 10 agonizing minutes, the house was a storm of violence and threats, until finally, the heavy thud of the front door signaled their departure. They remained in the hole for another 2 hours, the silence of the house thick and heavy before the widow finally lifted the door. "They have gone to watch the main road," the widow said as she helped them out of the dark. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. "They will return at dawn to sweep the woods with the dogs. You cannot stay here." She provided them with fresh clothes, simple, sturdy garments that made them look like local laborers rather than fugitives, and a small map drawn on a piece of silk that could be easily hidden. "The next station is 15 miles north across the broad river. There is a man named Silas who keeps a ferry. Tell him the widow sent thee to see the dawn." As they prepared to leave, Zora looked at the woman who had risked everything for 2 people she didn't know. "Why?" Zora asked softly. "Why do you help us when you know what they'll do to you?" The widow looked at her, a flicker of iron in her gaze. "Because the light of God is in every soul, Zora, and to see that light extinguished by chains is a burden my own soul cannot carry. Now go, before the sun finds thee." They stepped back out into the night, the cool air a shock after the stifling cellar. The journey was far from over, but as they moved toward the river, the weight of the death couple label felt a little lighter, replaced by the quiet, steady fire of a hope that refused to be buried. The broad river was a churning artery of silver and silt, cutting a jagged line through the foothills of the mountains. By the time Zora and Kaelen reached the muddy banks, the moon was low, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach out from the Kentucky border. They found Silas near a cluster of weeping willows, his flatboat a dark, low-slung shape against the water. Silas was a man of few words, his skin the color of well-oiled walnut, and his eyes perpetually squinted, as if searching for a horizon that didn't exist. He didn't offer a hand or a greeting, he simply waited for the password. "The widow sent us to see the dawn," Zora whispered, her voice trembling slightly from the biting autumn chill. Silas nodded once, a sharp, economical movement, and gestured for them to board. The flatboat was a primitive craft, little more than a raft with aspirations, but in the clandestine geography of the Underground Railroad, it was a vessel of salvation. As Silas pushed off with a long pole, the current grabbed them, and for a moment they were untethered from the earth, suspended in a watery limbo between the life they had fled and the freedom they couldn't yet imagine. The crossing was an exercise in absolute silence. Silas moved with a rhythmic precision, his pole slicing the water without a splash, a skill born of 1,000 midnight passages. He stayed close to the overhanging branches of the northern bank, using the darkness of the tree line to mask their silhouette. This was the arithmetic of distance, The realization that every mile covered on water was worth 3 on land, as it left no tracks and confused the sensitive noses of the tracking hounds. However, the river was also a bottleneck, a natural checkpoint where the slave patrols focused their vigilance. As they reached the midpoint of the broad river, the distant rhythmic thud of horse hooves echoed from the southern bank. A lantern flared, a single malevolent eye of orange light sweeping across the water. Zora pressed herself flat against the damp wood of the raft, her heart pounding against the deck. The light skimmed over them, missing the low profile of the flatboat by a matter of yards. Silas didn't flinch. He simply leaned into the pole, his muscles corded like iron cables, driving them into the safety of the northern shadows. Once they touched the northern shore, Silas handed Kaelen a small, heavy bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "The Blue Ridge foothills start 10 miles from here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The climb is steep and the air is thin. You'll find a cave near the hanging rock. Look for the mark of the broken wheel. It's a dry camp, but safe. The hunters don't like the heights. They're horsemen, and the mountain don't care for horses." He also gave them a small compass, a brass instrument that felt like a holy relic in Zora's hand. This was the informational core of their survival, the transition from navigating by stars to navigating by terrain. The mountains offered a vertical sanctuary, a place where the geography favored the fugitive. But the mountains were also a test of physical endurance. Zora's boots, already worn thin from the low-country muck, were beginning to fail. Each step on the rising incline was a lesson in pain, her calves screaming and her breath coming in ragged gasps. Kaelen walked beside her, his presence a silent pillar of strength, occasionally reaching out to steady her when the loose shale gave way beneath her feet. They spent the third day of the mountain trek huddled in the limestone cave Silas had described. The entrance was a narrow slit, hidden behind a curtain of frozen ivy, opening into a cathedral of damp stone and ancient silence. As they sat in the darkness, sharing a handful of dried corn, the psychological weight of the $2,500 bounty seemed to follow them even into the heights. They were the Death Couple, a name that had transformed them into legends of infamy in every tavern and town square from South Carolina to the Ohio River. The irony was a bitter pill. They had never sought violence, yet the system had branded them as killers to ensure that any citizen who encountered them would feel justified in using lethal force. If you're finding value in this deep dive into the harrowing reality of the mountain passage, hit that like button and subscribe. Your engagement helps us bring these stories of impossible odds to life. Drop a comment below. Do you think the mountains were a friend or a foe to those seeking freedom? For Zora, the answer was both. The mountain hid them, but it also threatened to break their bodies before they ever reached the border. The mountain pass was a gauntlet of exposure. As they reached the summit of the ridge, the world opened up below them, a vast undulating sea of forest and farm, stretching toward the hidden line of the Ohio River. But the beauty was deceptive. In the valley below, they could see the dust clouds raised by a large search party. Harlan Vance hadn't given up. He had simply recalibrated. He was using a network of local scouts and mountain men, people who knew the ridges as well as Silas knew the river. These scouts were vigilance committees in reverse, groups of white men motivated by the promise of the bounty and a deep-seated fear of the precedent Zora and Kaelen were setting. To the establishment, a successful escape wasn't just a loss of property, it was a leak in the dam of their entire social order. As Zora watched the distant riders, she realized that they were no longer just running from a plantation. They were running through a burning house, and the only way out was forward, through the final, most dangerous gate of all. The border states where the law was a jagged, inconsistent thing. The transition into the border territory required a change in tactics. Here, the Fugitive Slave Act created a legal minefield. Even in areas where slavery was unpopular, the law compelled citizens to assist in the recovery of runaways. This meant that the safe houses were fewer, and the risk for the conductors was significantly higher. They reached a small settlement near the Kentucky-Ohio line, a place where the air smelled of wood smoke and the tension was a physical vibration. They were directed to a blacksmith shop, a place of fire and iron that felt like home to Kaelen. The smith was a man named Lucius, a giant with a gentle spirit who had spent his life mending the chains of others while secretly forging the keys to their freedom. "The river is 2 days' walk," Lucius told them. his face illuminated by the glow of the forge. But the bridge is barred, and the ferries are watched by men with long rifles and longer memories. You won't get across as you are. You need a disguise, and you need a miracle. He began to describe a plan that involved a merchant's wagon and a hidden compartment, a final, desperate gamble that would either land them in Cincinnati or on the gallows. As they prepared for the final stretch, Zora looked at her reflection in a bucket of water. She was unrecognizable from the woman who had sat on the straw pallet in South Carolina. Her face was hollowed by hunger, her eyes bright with a feverish, haunted intensity, and her skin was a map of the journey they had survived. She was no longer a piece of property worth $500. She was a woman who had crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and outlasted the hounds. But as the fear of the final crossing began to take hold, she realized that the death couple wasn't a name the hunters had given them. It was a testament to the fact that they were willing to face death 1,000 times over just for one day of life that belonged to them. The Ohio River was waiting, a wide gray ribbon of hope and terror, and as they stepped toward the merchant's wagon, Zora felt the weight of every soul who had ever made this journey, their silent voices urging her toward the shore. The wagon was a coffin of pine and false hope, a rolling tomb where the air tasted of cedar shavings and the copper tang of primal fear. Zora and Kaelen lay pressed together in a space barely 6 inches deep, a hidden compartment built into the belly of the delivery wagon. Above them, the driver whistled a jaunty, nervous tune to mask the silence, his boots thumping rhythmically against the floorboards that served as their ceiling. Every jolt of the iron-rimmed wheels over the frozen ruts of the Kentucky road sent a spike of agony through Zora's cramped limbs. Yet she remained perfectly motionless, her breathing shallow and synchronized with Kaelen's. This was the false bottom technique, a masterpiece of abolitionist engineering that turned ordinary commerce into a clandestine ferry. Historically, these wagons were the unsung heroes of the movement, capable of bypassing the vigilance committees that patrolled the southern turnpikes. As the wagon groaned toward the Ohio River, the informational reality of their situation became a physical weight. They were currently in a legal gray zone. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, even if they reached the North, the federal government was obligated to hunt them. Freedom wasn't just a destination, it was a constant moving target that required them to outrun the very laws of the land. The wagon slowed to a halt, the sound of agitated horses and harsh voices signaling the final checkpoint before the river. Zora's heart hammered against the floorboards, a frantic percussion that seemed loud enough to alert the world. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sharp metallic odor of gun oil. "Wagon's heavy today, merchant," a voice growled, Harlan Vance. The name alone was a cold finger down Zora's spine. He had tracked them across 3 states, driven by the $2,500 bounty and a personal vendetta against the death couple who had made a mockery of his professional reputation. "Just iron work and grain for the Cincinnati foundries," the driver replied, his voice steady but strained. Zora heard the sharp thunk of a rifle butt striking the side of the wagon, followed by the heavy, measured footsteps of a man circling the vehicle. Vance was a predator who understood that the most effective hiding places were the ones in plain sight. He wasn't just looking for people, he was looking for the subtle shifts in a wagon's suspension, the slight hesitation in a driver's eyes, the mathematics of a load that didn't quite add up. The tension in the air was so thick it felt as though the pine boards might splinter under the pressure. Vance's footsteps stopped directly beside the rear wheel, mere inches from where Zora's face was pressed against the wood. "There's a rumor in the taverns," Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory purr. "They say the death couple can turn into smoke and vanish into the hills, but I think they're just flesh and bone, hiding in the dark like rats." Zora felt Kaelen's hand tighten around the handle of the iron knife, his knuckles pressing against her side. If the boards were lifted, they wouldn't go quietly. They would fulfill the very legend the hunters had created. But then a sudden commotion erupted further down the line, the sound of a ferry horn and a group of riders shouting about a sighting further upstream. The psychological pressure of the hunt worked both ways. The searchers were as jumpy as the searched. Vance hesitated, his greed for the bounty warring with his suspicion. "Move on!" he finally spat, the wagon jolting forward as the driver lashed the horses. If you've followed Zora and Kaelen through every mountain pass and swamp to reach this final heart-stopping moment, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement ensures these stories of the human spirit's triumph reach those who need them. Comment below with the word freedom to show your support for their journey. They reached the banks of the Ohio River under a sky the color of a bruised plum. The river was a half-mile of churning, ice-flecked water, a liquid border that represented the greatest psychological threshold of their lives. Silas's contact, a man named Miller, was waiting with a small skiff hidden beneath a dock of rotting timber. "The river is the line," Miller whispered as he helped them out of the wagon's belly. "On that side, you are property. On this side, you are people. But the water is indifferent to both." As they rowed across the dark expanse, the Kentucky shore began to recede, the lanterns of the patrollers appearing as tiny, harmless sparks in the distance. This was the great crossing, the moment where the geography of oppression was finally severed. Informational records suggest that for many freedom seekers, the physical sensation of crossing the Ohio was accompanied by a literal weight lifting from their chests, a biological response to the cessation of the fight-or-flight state that had defined their existence for weeks. The water lapped against the hull, a rhythmic, cooling song that promised a world where their names belonged only to them. The skiff touched the northern bank with a soft, muddy thud. Zora stepped out first, her feet sinking into the Ohio soil. It didn't look different from the soil of South Carolina. It was still brown, still cold, still damp. But as she stood there, she realized the invisible lines of the world had shifted. In the eyes of Ohio law, she was a free woman, a soul who could no longer be bought, sold, or bartered. Kaelen joined her, his large hand finding hers in the darkness. They weren't the death couple here, they were simply two travelers who had reached the end of a long, impossible road. The transition into free soil was a legal and spiritual metamorphosis. While the threat of federal marshals remained a reality, the immediate terror of the plantation and the local patrols had vanished into the mist of the river. They stood for a long moment in the silence of the Ohio woods, the only sound the distant whistle of a train, a real railroad that would soon carry them even further north, toward the absolute sanctuary of Canada. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Zora and Kaelen walked toward the lights of Cincinnati. They found the boarding house Lucius had described, a warm brick building where a woman was already beginning her morning chores. When she saw them, blackened by coal dust, hollowed by hunger, but standing tall with the pride of the liberated, she didn't ask for papers. She simply opened her arms. "You've come a long way, children," she said, her voice a soft, steady anchor. "But you can stop running now." Zora looked back at the river, the wide grey ribbon that had seen so much sorrow and so much hope, the Sterling plantation, the death couple posters, and the shadow of Harlan Vance felt like a dream she was finally waking from. They had survived the swamp, the mountains, and the river. They had paid the price of the choosing, and in return, they had reclaimed the one thing the world had tried to take, their tomorrow. The journey was over, and as the sun rose fully over the Free State, Zora realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't watching the future. She was living it.